Matilda Lockhart was captured by a Comanche war party in the fall of 1838. Her and 4 other children, her neighbors, were harvesting pecans near their home on the Guadalupe River near modern DeWitt, Texas. As the kids returned home, they entered a clearing at the edge of a prairie. Standing in front of them was a sea of horses, each with a rider, a painted Comanche warrior. Matilda was the oldest at just 14. As soon as she saw the warriors, she dropped her pecan bucket and ran as fast as she could for home. As she ran, she heard the cries of the other children. She wanted to help. She stopped to turn back. A mistake. The Comanche were already tying the others to the horses. As a warrior rode up to her, she already knew what was about to happen. She was about to be taken by the Comanche. Events like the capture of Matilda Lockhart and the Putnam children are the kind of events that draw reactions from the communities involved. In the case of Texas and the Comanche, it is one of the catalysts that will lead to one of the most violent blood feuds in the history of the West. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. But before we get to our story, today, in 2024, the majority of us live a substantial portion of our lives on the internet. But just because the internet is a digital space doesn't mean it's safe. That is why I use Delete Me, the most trusted source in online privacy. Behind the scenes, silent operators, data brokers, are collecting and selling your personal information without your consent. It's the reason why you receive targeted ads and unsolicited emails. We are even vulnerable to more malicious parties that look at your data as opportunities for scams and identity theft. As a rather private person, it's something that really bothers me. But that's where Delete Me comes in for help. Their service specializes in removing your personal information from data broker databases. By doing so, they act as a shield to protect you from the dangers of data exploitation. They give you back control of your online identity. Delete Me offers me peace of mind, because I know that they're helping protect me from unwanted exposure. Take charge of your privacy today and get 20% off of Delete Me US consumer plans. Go to joindeleteme.com/dates. Just use the promo code DATES at checkout. It is also linked in the video description. Don't let data brokers dictate your digital footprint. Choose Delete Me because your privacy matters. But now back to our story. In February of 1839, just a few months after the capture of Matilda Lockhart, a company of 63 Texans led by Colonel John Moore and 16 live pan Apache Indians headed north into Comancheria. It was a punitive expedition, retaliation for recent raids and kidnappings, one that was reckless. White settlers to date had proved no match for mounted Comanche warriors. Attempts at negotiating with Comanche had always failed. The Texans were ignored or bypassed. Their young government leaders felt a show of force was necessary in order to pacify their neighbors. If they caught them off guard in their own territory, maybe they could inflict damage. Colonel Moore and his company traveled northwest following the Colorado River. For days they faced harsh northers, winter weather that left them freezing and killed several of their horses. The further they progressed, the more discouraged they got. Their Apache guides, mortal enemies of the Comanches, had lost the trail in the storm. They feared they wouldn't be able to find them. But, after days of misery, they caught the sign they were looking for. Smoke was seen, rising from campfires in the distance. The sign was both cause for celebration and dread for the party. As they made preparation that night, being so close to the Comanche tested their nerves. Noah Smithwick, a ranger along with the company, wrote of the experience. Quote, "While riding along about dark, we heard a wolf howl behind us. My guide stopped short and assumed a listening attitude. In a few moments, another answered, way to the right. Still the Indian listened so intently that his form seemed perfectly rigid. Then another set up a howl on our left. Oomph, Lobo, said the live pan, in a tone of relief. I can't say I admired the music of the wolf at any time, but it certainly never had more unmusical sound than on that occasion. And when I saw that even an Indian's ears were uncertain whether it was a wolf or Comanche, I felt the cold chills creeping over me." End quote. They were right to be concerned. 2 of the Apache moved forward to scout the exact position of the camp. When they returned, they said it was massive, much larger than they thought it would be. Colonel Moore weighed his options. This was a greater risk than he intended, but with men in his company, like Andrew Lockhart, Matilda's father, he knew that attacking was the only option. It is what they had come here to do. As they always did to fight, they dismounted their horses. As dawn broke, they continued to approach the Comanche village. No sentinels were posted. The Comanche didn't fear attack within their own territory. 2 centuries of war had pacified their neighboring tribes. They didn't believe white men would be so brazen as to travel this far into Comancheria. This was Moore's chance. The entire village was completely undefended. Moore ordered his company to attack. Smithwick wrote of the experience, quote, "We then crept upon the sleeping Indians, who were not dreaming of an attack. As soon as daylight gave us the exact situation of the camp, we made a rush for it, pouring a volley right into the lodges. Taken completely by surprise, the savages bounded from their lodges and scattered like partridges. Our men rushed right in among the lodges, the women and children screaming, dogs barking, men yelling and shooting. In a moment transformed the peaceful scene, on which the day had but just dawned, into a pandemonium." End quote. The attack had worked. The Comanche were caught completely by surprise. Andrew Lockhart marched through the Comanche village calling for his daughter. All of the soldiers were embedded in the camp. Fearing that the disorganization would cause friendly fire, Colonel Moore reluctantly called for a retreat. Had Moore continued to advance, he might have been able to stop what happened next. The scattering partridges, as Smithwick called them, had fled from the danger, but in doing so they had rushed to their horses. The Apache had been tasked with stampeding them, but failed to do so. Within moments, dozens of Comanche warriors were now fully mounted. The Comanche always fought mounted. They were deadly with a bow, and on horseback they were more mobile and could fire at their enemy far faster than any white man with a muzzle loader could dream of. Worse, Moore's men had left their horses behind in their advance. They fought on foot. The Comanche quickly circled around and stampeded them. It was at this point when Colonel Moore realized how dangerous it was to make a mistake in fighting these people. Moore's men were now stranded and surrounded. What started as a rout in a moment had turned into a disaster. The only thing that saved them from complete annihilation was a cedar brake that they were able to reach for cover. Using their rifles as deterrents, the company kept the buzzing Comanche horde from advancing. Had they chosen to do so, the Comanche could have easily overwhelmed Moore's small force. But that wasn't their way. It never was. The losses that they would take, moving on a position of cover, wasn't worth the risk. The Comanche didn't take on fortified positions. That's how white men fought. They fought from advantage and moved away when it didn't suit them. For a while, the Comanche performed bluff charges, but unable to get the Texans to leave the area of cover, they eventually moved on. An act of mercy. In time, when it seemed safe to move again, Moore led his mountless and humiliated force to march back home down the Colorado. They were lucky to be alive, and not ready to fight the Comanche. Between the time when Texas became an independent republic in 1836 and 1840, they were constantly experiencing Comanche raids. Attempts like Moore's expedition in 1839 just showed that there was a talent gap between the two at this point. Over the previous decades, thousands of Spanish, Mexican, and Texans had been killed at the hands of the Comanche. The Texas government needed a way to stop the bleeding, long enough to figure out how to manage the problem. But in late February 1840, 3 chiefs of the Panatica, the southernmost band of the Comanche, solved that problem for them when they rode into San Antonio looking to make a truce. This was the first time this had ever happened. Up until this point, it seemed like violence would continue to escalate between the two sides. The Comanche chiefs were met by a colonel named Henry Carnes. Through an intermediary, they asked to make an agreement for peace. This was wonderful news for the Texans, but not one that they could accept outright. The Texas government, under President Mirabeau Lamar, had recently taken a very aggressive stance toward Native Americans in the Republic. One thing the Republic would not stand for was the keeping of white prisoners by the Indians. Before any peace could be made, Carnes had to make one condition to the Comanche clear. All live prisoners of the Panatica had to be returned to the Texans for there to be any peace. To this point, the Texans had proved to be little trouble for the Comanche, at least outside of the defended towns and cities. It was a brash demand. The Texans were not in a position of power, so it was to everyone's surprise when the Comanche agreed. When the groups left each other, they agreed to meet again in 23 days. A parley existed in that time. Neither side was to attack the other. Good news for the frontier settlers especially. The raids were common and deadly. In just 4 years, the Comanche had taken over 200 prisoners and murdered far more than that. For perspective, in 1840, Texas had a population of roughly 70,000 settlers. 70,000 is a mid-sized city in the U.S. today. If in your town an entire grade level worth of middle schoolers were taken in a couple of years, you would pay mind to it. And it wasn't just that people were taken, it was how they were treated. The Comanche were notoriously brutal to their captives. Men could expect to be tortured to death. Women and children might be adopted, but that doesn't mean that they were spared unspeakable abuse. Captives spoke of constant beatings and bruises, being burned and cut, and worse. In the minds of settlers, it was a constant fear, and for those taken and their families, it was unbearable. A truce would truly benefit both sides. The Comanche were getting the better of the violent exchanges in the 1830s, but they were taking losses, both in battle and as a result of disease outbreaks. The losses were not enough to make the Bannatica want peace. They wanted peace most likely because of trade. The Bannatica were the southernmost Comanche band. Other large and powerful bands like the Yamparica, Cotsutica, and Quahati were not situated directly on the borderlands between the Plains and Texas settlers. They didn't need peace. They had a buffer. But the Bannatica were right there. Decades so close to Spanish, Mexican, and now Texas influence had led to a change in the Bannatica. They had become addicted to European goods. Metal was great for edged weapons, knives, and pots. Cotton made better clothing than animal skins, and many Comanche were even starting to carry guns, although their primary weapons were still bows and lances. A truce with the Texans gave the Bannatica opportunities for trade beyond what they would get in other circumstances. They didn't care that the Texans wanted their captives back. Peace on the border would be good for them, and they would still raid into Mexico just as they always did. They would still be able to take captives from them. Giving up the white captives wouldn't be a big deal. Besides, the Europeans had always paid a high price for them before. When the Bannatica arrived to meet the Texans on March 19th in San Antonio, they did so with 65 Comanche. A chief named Spear Talker led the procession. There were 33 warriors, 12 of which were chiefs, and the rest were women and children. When the Comanche set up their camps, the Texans noticed immediately that they didn't bring with them the number of captives they were expecting. There were only two, a Mexican boy and now the 16-year-old Matilda Lockhart. Before the meeting, the Comanche handed the two over to the Texans as a sign of good faith. That was a mistake. The Comanche would have expected a prisoner to be returned in the manner they returned Matilda Lockhart. The Texans were horrified and infuriated. Years later, a settler present in San Antonio, Mary Maverick, wrote of the conditions of Matilda in her memoirs. Mary described her whole body as being full of bruises and sores. Matilda was emaciated, and most notably, the Comanche had burnt off her nose. Matilda described to the Texas commissioners what it was like to have been with the Comanche, how she was constantly beaten, how when Colonel Moore's company had attacked in 1839, it was Spirit Talker's camp. She was present, and she had heard her father calling for her. The Comanche drowned out her screams with their own before taking her away. She talked about how when a Comanche village was close to a Texas town, they would burn the bottoms of her feet to prevent her from trying to escape. She said that she had been utterly degraded, a coded phrase, well known to those on the plains. To the Comanche, this was normal. It is how they would have expected to have been treated if they themselves were taken captive. When Plains Indians captured men, they were almost always tortured to death. It was one of the reasons why Plains Indians never surrendered in battle. Their fate was locked. They could either escape or fight to the death. Matilda was a cruel reminder to the Texans of what captives were experiencing with the Comanche. There were more, and the Comanche hadn't brought the others as they had agreed. Prior to the meeting, Matilda told the Texans that she knew of at least 15 more prisoners, and that she had overheard the Comanche talk about their intent to ransom them. These conditions were untenable to the Texans. Under European custom, they believed themselves to have sovereignty over all the subjects in the land they claimed. They believed that the Comanche were subject to their law and could be punished in accordance with it. They were under orders to arrest the chiefs if they didn't present the prisoners that they had agreed to. The Comanche, not surprisingly, would not have viewed themselves subject to any law outside the customs of their own tribe, and being held prisoner would mean a fight to the death. These were the conditions that the first major meeting between Texans and the Comanche were to take place. The delegations would meet that night in a one-story limestone building next to the San Antonio jail. It was called the Council House. Comanche women and children roamed outside the council house on March 19th, expecting no trouble. The Comanche boys entertained and impressed the townspeople by shooting coins they would throw up into the air with their toy bows. Inside the council house, the meeting immediately took a different tone. 12 Comanche chiefs, painted and led by Spirit Talker, sat on the floor opposite the Texas commissioners. Through an interpreter, the Texans immediately addressed the elephant in the room. They demanded to know why the Comanche had only brought one white captive with them to the meeting. Spirit Talker explained to them that he had brought the captives in his camp, as he agreed to do. He said that he had no control over the captives in the other camps, but, he added, that he believed that the other chiefs would be willing to give them up for ransom. He even addressed the goods they would likely take in exchange. Then he issued a rather famous line. He said, "How do you like that answer?" The actions of the Texans were swift and clear. They did not. Soldiers were then ordered into the council house. Unable to understand what the white men were saying, the Comanche watched. They were confused as to what was happening. In their custom, no violence would be permitted in council. They felt they should be safe. Customs like this were sacred. Violating them would mean that medicine or power wouldn't work. It would have been unthinkable. The Texans had no such customs. Believing themselves superior to who they viewed as pagan savages, they felt free to take the action they saw as appropriate. The interpreter was ordered to inform the chiefs that they would be held hostage until the white captives in all their camps were returned. Initially, the interpreter refused. He told the soldiers that if he delivered that message, the chiefs would immediately attack and fight to the death to be freed. As a former captive himself, he understood, but the Texans insisted. Reluctantly, he delivered the message, leaving the room directly afterward. He was right to do so. Once the chiefs understood what had been communicated, they let out a loud war whoop. Spirit Talker, in an instant, rushed at the guard at the door and stabbed him. An officer screamed for the soldiers to fire, and the council house became a horrible slaughter. Gunshots, smoke, and scream filled the tiny space. Both Comanche and Texans were killed. Hearing the noises of screams and gunshots, the Comanche women and children outside ran for their weapons. They understood that they had been betrayed. Before it was even clear that a fight was taking place, a judge, flipping coins to a Comanche child, caught a small arrow in the heart from his toy bow. But the fight was not a fair one for the Comanche. They were not mounted, and even if they were, the city streets were narrow and difficult to maneuver. The soldiers who outnumbered them quickly surrounded the town, and the Comanche were overwhelmed. Many fled and were shot as they ran. Others, including women and children, fought and died as warriors as the soldiers scoured the streets hunting them. 2 Comanche barricaded themselves inside a home. The townspeople used turpentine to set it on fire, forcing them out before shooting one and killing the other with an axe. Not a single Comanche escaped. When the violence stopped, 33 Comanche were dead, including the Spirit Talker and the other 11 chiefs. 32 others were taken prisoner and thrown in jail. 7 Texans were killed. 10 more were injured. In Texas history, this event became known as the Council House Fight. The morning after the massacre, the Texans wanted to send a message to the rest of the Comanche. They took one of the female prisoners and sent her on a horse back to her people. The Comanche the Texans were holding prisoner were to be executed, unless the Comanche released all of their white captives. They were given 12 days to do so. When the other camps of Comanche learned about what happened in the council house fight, they were enraged. Councils were sacred spaces. To do violence there was an unforgivable act of betrayal. They practiced their mourning rites, wailing and cutting themselves with knives. Soon, they took their anger in a different direction. The captives that the Texans demanded to be freed, 13 of them were tortured and executed. They included at least one of the Putnam children who were captured with Matilda Lockhart. Some, after having been adopted into Comanche families, were roasted over a fire in retaliation for the crimes of the Texans. This was done by the women. The men rode around looking for violence. Outside the more defensible towns, settlements experienced months of constant raids. All Texans on the frontier were in danger, and countless were killed. The Blood-Feud had escalated. An attempt at peace had brought in the worst season of violence yet between the two sides. There would be no further negotiations. None could be had in good faith. The Texas militias and military did what they could to chase off raiders, but there was little they could do to stop them, and they knew not to pursue them too far to the north. Despite the lack of prisoner exchange, Most of the Comanche prisoners that were taken by the Texans did eventually escape and return to their tribe. By early summer, the Texans could breathe a sigh of relief. After a few months of terror, the raids had stopped. They prayed that this would be the end. It wasn't. In late July, 1,000 Comanches, including 400 warriors, were gathered on the Edwards Plateau at the edge of Comancheria. Buffalo Hump had had a vision. The cousin of Spirit Talker, he had become one of the principal war chiefs since the Council House fight. He dreamed of vengeance. His vision saw the Comanche drive the Texans to the sea. He saw a massive Comanche raid, destroying every settlement in their path. The Comanche were going to make the Texans feel what it meant to betray them. In early summer, the raids on the settlements had stopped because he had sent messengers across the Buffalo Plains to recruit warriors for this purpose. Many of the northern bands, the ones away from Texas encroachment, failed to send many to his cause. Buffalo Hump would have to earn their trust after the death of so many Panatica leaders. Despite the odds, on August 1st, they were ready to descend on Texas in a campaign to destroy it. Buffalo Hump's war party was more than just warriors. He brought along women and children too. It is clear evidence that he intended a long campaign. As they moved toward the Gulf, they carefully avoided San Antonio. There was trouble there. Vulnerable settlements, easy targets, were further southeast. On the night of August 4th, the camp of 1,000 Comanche traveled by the city, completely unnoticed. Later, the trail was discovered. That many people moving on horseback was not an easy thing to hide. They made a wide path, and when it was discovered, Texans who had experienced many raids knew what they were seeing. Ranger Captain Ben McCullough took swift action. He dispatched riders to rally militias, calling upon the rugged frontiersmen to stand against the impending threat. He estimated that the Comanche had passed through 2 days before. He was right, but now it was August 6th, and the Comanche had reached the town of Victoria. They made an impression. The city had no advanced warning for what they faced. Historian T.R. Fehrenbach describes the scene. Quote, "Whooping warriors appeared out of the blue, taking the settlement by complete surprise, and cut down several luckless inhabitants on the outskirts. They killed a number of black slaves working in the fields. Had they ridden immediately into the town and been prepared to hunt down the whites on foot, there is little question that their hundreds could have slaughtered the entire population. But, as always, this was not the Comanche way. Buffalo Hump's warriors circled the town like a bison stand, seizing horses and cattle." End quote. For a day, the Comanche taunted the people inside of Victoria. The buzzing horde stayed outside the town, unwilling to lay full siege. But the Comanche didn't mind. They had struck terror into the people, and they had taken over 2,000 horses and mules for their trouble. Many inside Buffalo Hump's camp were becoming very excited about the goods they would be able to plunder. He was able to bring the war party back on their trail of destruction. On August 7th, they continued to make their way down the coast. As they did, Ben McCullough and the Rangers were now riding behind the Comanche path. What they found shocked them. They were left to bury the victims. Around 15 were killed in Victoria. On August 8th, Buffalo Hump's warriors reached the outskirts of Linville. Linville was about 50 miles from Victoria, on the Gulf Coast. It was used as a port to send materials to San Antonio. The only warning the town had was when some of their citizens noticed a cloud of dust coming toward the town from a distance. They assumed it was horse traders from Mexico. In the morning hours, many of the inhabitants of the town were still asleep. J.W. Wilbarger described the scene in the book Indian Depredations in Texas. Quote, "The war whoop of the wild Comanche commingled with the screaming of the women, the crying of the children, and the groans of the dying and wounded." End quote. In a bizarre scene, many of the townspeople are able to escape to the boats anchored offshore in the bay because the leading men of the war party became distracted when they couldn't figure out how to take off the whalebone corset of a woman that they had captured. The Comanche cut down several of the inhabitants fleeing into the water, but by the time they had reached the shore, the majority of the population were now safe in the boats. They watched for a day as the Comanche burned and looted the town. Amidst the chaos, one brave or misguided soul, Judge Hayes, dared to challenge the Comanche. From the boats, he waded in the water toward the shore. Armed with a gun, later determined to be unloaded, he goaded the Comanche to come out and kill him. The Comanche thought he was crazy. They mocked him by laughing and then pretending that he wasn't there. Eventually, he thought better of his actions and returned to the ships. When the war party discovered the horses and warehouses in the city, whatever control that Buffalo Hump had over his raiders was completely gone. The warriors quickly lost interest in violence and focused solely on the goods. This wasn't uncommon for Comanche raids. They found and took things that they wouldn't typically have interest in, like suit jackets and umbrellas. But they did find a lot of other practical goods. The war party had reached the sea and murdered many Texans, but now they were becoming aimless, with nowhere else to go and having collected massive amounts of loot. We will never know if Buffalo Hump felt his revenge against the Texans had been fulfilled, but after a day, he gave the order to return to the plains. The loot and captives were strapped to the stolen mules, and the horse herd that had grown 3,000 in number slowly started to lumber north toward the plains. The town of Linville was left so burned and destroyed that it was never rebuilt. But as the Comanche left, the Texans had been mounting forces in an attempt to stop them. Now it was their turn for violence. As the Comanche were destroying Linville, Ben McCullough had been warning as many towns as he could while recruiting fighters for his cause. Since the Comanche were discovered on the 4th, he was able to send out messengers and gradually collect more men for help. They needed more if they were going to take on Buffalo Hump's war party. The plan was to cut them off at Plum Creek. Usually, following a raid, Comanche would ride as far as they could, splitting up in order to create distance and confuse pursuers. But that is not what Buffalo Hump did this time. His party stayed together and took a predictable route, likely because the amount of supplies they collected had forced them to move slowly. By August 12th, 200 Texans, military, ranger, and militia, gathered at Plum Creek to cut off the retreating Comanche. Famous Texans were there, including Rangers Ben McCullough, Bigfoot Wallace, and Jack Coffee Hayes. Brigadier General Felix Houston assumed command, but wisely deferred to the advice of the more veteran Indian fighters. When the Comanche arrived at Plum Creek, they were not prepared for a fight. Much of the Comanche were preoccupied by managing their horses and mules, but when the Texans marched to them in large columns, the Comanche took a familiar pose. Their mounted warriors took a forward position, shouting and maneuvering around the Texans. The intimidating display was made slightly ridiculous by the Comanche carrying umbrellas and wearing European suit jackets, along with horned headdresses. The Texans, outnumbered, were in a dangerous position. If they didn't act, the Comanche would be able to move past them, and they might miss their chance. But they caught some luck. A Comanche warrior had become reckless. With his shield, he had ridden out too close to the line of the Texans. He was screaming insults and calling for combat. He likely believed he was protected from danger by Comanche medicine. A shot rang out from the Texas lines, and the warrior fell dead from the saddle. After a moment of silent suspense, the Comanche began to howl. Something had gone wrong with the medicine, and the Texans seized the moment. Ben McCullough knew that mobility had been the key to fighting the Comanche, and had convinced General Houston to call for mounted charges against them. As the Comanche seemed disorganized, the Texans charged, this time on horseback. When they got within firing distance with their rifles, they released a volley at the warriors. Chaos ensued. In a moment, as many as 15 Indians were thrown from their horses. The loose horses stampeded and slammed into the pack mules, causing a pileup of bodies on the muddy ground. The Comanche found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They were unable to maneuver. In the madness, the Texans began reloading and firing second and third volleys. The Comanche panicked, and the war party began to flee. For the next 15 miles, the Texans pursued them, firing after them as they went into a running fight. The Comanche stopped only to kill the prisoners that they had tied to their horses, and drop goods off their mules to lighten the load. Buffalo Hump's great raid had turned into a race for survival. In the end, the Comanche had lost most of the loot that they had picked up, but the Texans only recovered a few hundred of several thousand stolen horses. Death tolls vary. Some Texans claimed as many as 80 Comanche were killed in the Battle of Plum Creek. However, less than 20 total bodies were recovered. Although several of the Texan fighters were injured, only one died in the battle. When the fighting was stopped, the Texas government urged further punitive expedition for the raids. President Lamar was pushing for a policy of extermination. The Battle of Plum Creek had marked a decisive victory for the Texans, one that they previously had not had against the Comanche at this scale. However, the violence, as in with all blood feuds, only leads to greater violence. This is where we see a shift that is really important for where the story goes from here. As the Texans continue to fight the Comanche, many will learn from their experiences and make adjustments. Just a couple months after Plum Creek, in October, Colonel Moore will be sent back up the Colorado River to find Comanche in another punitive expedition. But this time he doesn't make the same mistakes. In 1839 at Saba, when he found the Comanche village, he failed to stampede their horses, and he and his men dismounted to fight. The charge at Plum Creek demonstrated how effective cavalry charges and mobility could be in a fight against the Comanche. It is how they fought, and how many Texans would fight from this point on. But the Comanche would make the same errors. Deep in their own territory, feeling like the Texans would not dare attack them there, they again failed to post sentinels. This time, when Moore attacks, the entire Comanche village of 50 people is slaughtered. In his own report, he wrote, quote, "The bodies of the men, women, and children were to be seen on every hand, wounded, dying, and dead." End quote. He returned from his post with 500 captured horses. The Comanche made no further raids on Texans that year. Unfortunately, on a long enough timeline, that is how blood feuds end. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you liked it, take a look at this one if you want to know what it was like to survive a raid by the Comanche.